2 days before my wedding, I sat at a table that felt less like a place for family and more like a battlefield. The Crawfords' dining room was the kind of space meant to intimidate. Dark mahogany furniture, chandelier that spilled cold light across the table, and a silence that pressed down heavier than the ornate drapes on the windows. My fiancé, Ethan, sat to my left, nervous fingers tapping against his thigh. Across from me were his parents, Charles and Victoria Crawford, wearing the kind of smiles that weren't smiles at all. Charles cleared his throat, the sound deliberate and sharp. Without a word, he reached beneath the table and slid a manila folder toward me. The faint scrape of cardboard against wood sounded louder than it should have, echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. "Rachel," he said, his tone flat, his voice dripping with the authority of a man who had always expected obedience. "Sign this, or the marriage is off." My heart skipped, not from fear, but from recognition. This was their moment. The Crawfords had been waiting for this. Victoria leaned forward, resting her chin on her manicured hand, her smirk curling like a blade. "It's just a formality, dear, unless you have something to hide." I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't ask what was inside. I already knew. This wasn't a legal document. It was a test, an ultimatum designed to break me. They thought if they pushed me to the edge, I'd fold. They thought I'd beg Ethan to make them stop. They thought they had all the power. But what they didn't know was that they were already playing a game I'd been preparing for my entire life. Because unlike what they assumed, I wasn't some desperate girl clinging to the Crawford name for security. I wasn't marrying Ethan for money. I wasn't there to be saved. What they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that I had a fortune of my own. $15 million, built with my hands, my sweat, and my sleepless nights. I had a legal team sharper than any threat they could throw my way. And more than that, I had a strategy that would turn their smug ultimatum into the very thing that destroyed their arrogant smiles. But to understand how I got there, to that exact moment staring down two people who thought they'd already won, you have to know who we were. My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 29. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Greenville, raised by my mother, Linda Monroe, who worked as a school teacher. She wasn't just a mother. She was a warrior. She wore the same blazer for 15 years, ironed it every morning, and still managed to stand in front of her class with dignity no matter how tired she was. She raised me with one rule that became my armor: never let anyone treat you like you're less than. It's funny how one sentence, repeated enough, can mold you. That rule carried me through late nights teaching myself to code on a secondhand computer. It carried me through the heartbreak of failed prototypes, the grind of running a startup, and the bittersweet triumph of selling my company at 27. $15 million. More money than the Crawfords ever thought a girl like me could have. But I never flaunted it, because my wealth was never meant to impress. It was meant to protect. And then there was Ethan. I met him in a bookstore of all places, reaching for the same novel at the same time. He laughed, offered it to me, and somehow we ended up sharing coffee an hour later. Ethan was different. Where his parents were sharp and cold, he was warm, gentle, and endlessly curious. He asked about my favorite authors, not my net worth. He cared about how I felt, not what I could provide. I knew he loved me for me, but the shadow of his parents was always there. Charles, with his booming voice and inflated pride, looked at me like I was a trespasser in his empire. Victoria, with her flawless smile and sharper tongue, treated me like a temporary inconvenience. They didn't see a partner for their son. They saw a girl they assumed came with empty pockets and hungry eyes. So when that folder hit the table, I knew exactly what they thought. They thought I would panic, that I would look to Ethan for rescue, that I would sign away my dignity just to secure a future with their son. But instead, I sat still. I felt my mother's words echo through my mind. Never let anyone treat you like you're less than. I looked up straight into Victoria's calculating gaze and let a calm smile cross my face, because what they didn't know was that I hadn't come to their table defenseless. I had brought my own folder, and inside it was everything I needed to show them just how badly they had underestimated me. And if you want to understand why I didn't flinch that night, why I didn't reach for the pen or crumble under their ultimatum, you have to know where I came from. Because my story didn't start in the Crawfords' mansion or even when I met Ethan. It started in a tiny 2-bedroom house at the edge of Greenville with a woman who taught me the meaning of resilience. My mother, Linda Monroe, raised me on her own. She wasn't wealthy. She wasn't powerful in the way the Crawfords are. But she had a kind of strength you can't measure with money. She taught middle school English, grading papers at the kitchen table long after midnight, her eyes red from exhaustion. And yet every morning she was up before the sun, ironing the same worn blazer she'd worn for years, walking into her classroom with her head high. She was the one who told me, again and again, "Rachel, never let anyone treat you like you're less than." At the time, I didn't fully grasp it. I was just a kid, watching my mother stretch every dollar, cooking pasta 3 nights a week because it was cheap, fixing leaky faucets herself because plumbers cost too much. But her words stuck. They became the backbone of everything I would become. I wasn't born with money, but I was born with drive. My first computer was a discarded relic from my school, missing 2 keys and held together with duct tape. Most kids would have tossed it aside, but to me, it was a doorway. I taught myself to code on that machine, tapping out lines of commands until my fingers ached. By 17, I'd built a little app that helped local businesses manage schedules. By 22, I launched my first startup. By 27, I sold that company for $15 million. But here's the thing. I didn't change who I was. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't cover myself in designer brands. I invested wisely, kept my life simple, and never flaunted my success. Because I'd seen what money could do to people. It gave them arrogance. It gave them entitlement. It made them believe they were better than everyone else. And that's exactly what the Crawfords embodied. Which brings me to Ethan. I met him in the most ordinary, unassuming way, inside a bookstore. I was reaching for the lean startup, and he happened to grab it at the same time. Our fingers brushed. We laughed awkwardly, and somehow that small encounter turned into coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into late-night walks where time seemed to stand still. Ethan wasn't like his parents. He didn't brag. He didn't act entitled. He didn't look at me like I was something to be measured. He was genuine, thoughtful, and maybe a little shy. He loved cooking more than any boardroom, could lose hours in a record shop, and had the kind of laugh that made you forget your worries. I'll never forget the first time he cooked for me pasta in his small apartment kitchen. He burned the garlic bread, the smoke alarm blared, and we ended up laughing so hard that tears rolled down my cheeks. That night, I realized something important. This wasn't about money or appearances. This was about love, real love. But love doesn't exist in a vacuum. The first time Ethan introduced me to his parents, I knew I was walking into enemy territory. Charles Crawford looked me up and down like he was assessing a business deal. His handshake was firm but cold. He wasted no time in asking, "So, Rachel, what exactly do you do?" When I explained that I ran my own company, he chuckled, swirling his wine glass as if I'd told him I sold lemonade. "Ambitious," he said with a patronizing smile, "but surely not something you'll keep up once you're married." Victoria was worse. Her words were honeyed, but her tone cut deep. "Oh, entrepreneurship? That must be so unstable. But I suppose as long as Ethan takes care of you, it will be fine." I smiled politely, swallowed my pride, and told myself it was just the first impression, that maybe, with time, they'd see me for who I really was, but they never did. Every dinner, every holiday, every interaction was a subtle battle. They saw me as an outsider, a distraction, a girl who wasn't worthy of their son. Ethan always defended me. "Mom, Dad, Rachel's incredible." But his words were soft compared to their constant condescension. And though he tried, I could see the way their disapproval weighed on him. Still, I never told him about the fortune I'd built, not because I didn't trust him, but because I wanted to know, did he love me for me, or for what I had? Ethan proved time and again that his love was unconditional. But his parents? They never even gave me the chance, which is why, 2 days before the wedding, as I sat at their pristine dining table, I wasn't shocked when they tried to corner me. I wasn't even surprised. What they didn't realize was that I had been preparing for people like them my entire life. The night of the ultimatum began like any other dinner at the Crawfords' mansion, lavish, cold, and designed to remind me of my place. Their house wasn't just large, it was imposing. White stone walls, a sweeping staircase, and portraits of ancestors glaring down as if daring you to prove your worth. Every time I entered that house, I felt like I was stepping into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The dining room was no different. A chandelier the size of my entire living room hung above us, pouring a sterile light onto the polished mahogany table. The china was rimmed with gold, the silverware heavy in my hands, yet the air was thick with something far less refined, disdain. Charles sat at the head of the table, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. He was a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms, and tonight was no exception. Victoria, as always, sat poised beside him, her smile painted on like armor. And then there was Ethan beside me, fidgeting with his napkin as if he could sense the storm that was about to break. Dinner itself was a blur. There was food, some perfectly roasted duck with delicate sides, but it might as well have been cardboard. No one tasted it. No one cared. The only sounds were the clink of utensils and Charles's occasional grunt of approval at the wine. Ethan tried to spark small talk, asking about their recent trip to Napa, but his parents dismissed him with curt replies. Their minds weren't on travel or food. They were waiting. And then it came. As dessert plates were cleared, Charles leaned back, reached beneath the table, and produced a manila folder. Without ceremony, he slid it across the table, the sound of cardboard against linen slicing through the silence. "Rachel," he said, his tone as sharp as a blade, "sign this, or the marriage is off." The world seemed to pause. Ethan straightened in shock. "Dad, what is this?" Victoria's smirk widened. She tilted her head, her eyes locking on me like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "It's just a formality," she said smoothly, her voice sweet but dripping with venom. "Unless, of course, Rachel has something to hide." I stared at the folder. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. A prenup designed not to protect their son, but to strip me of dignity. Clauses that would remind me every day that in their eyes, I wasn't an equal. I was a liability. Ethan's voice was soft, uncertain. "Rachel, maybe just sign it. It'll make them feel better." That cut deeper than the folder itself, not because Ethan doubted me, but because I could hear the fear in his voice, the fear of choosing between the woman he loved and the parents he still longed to please. He wasn't siding with them. He was pleading with me to avoid the explosion he knew was coming. Charles folded his arms, watching me like a judge waiting for a guilty plea. "It's simple. Sign and we move forward. Refuse and this wedding is over before it begins." Victoria added, her tone laced with false sweetness. "We just want to protect our family. Surely you understand, dear." Their arrogance was suffocating. The assumption that I was desperate, that I would cave, that I needed them more than they needed me, it made my blood boil. But beneath the anger was something steadier, clarity. This was never about money. This was about control, about putting me in my place, about reminding me that no matter how much Ethan loved me, in their eyes, I would never measure up. I felt my mother's voice rise in my chest as if she were sitting right beside me. "Never let anyone treat you like you're less than." So I didn't reach for the folder. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I folded my hands neatly in my lap, lifted my chin, and looked Charles in the eye, then Victoria. I let the silence stretch until their smirks faltered just slightly, as if they were starting to sense that something wasn't going according to plan. Finally, I spoke, my tone calm, even, almost too calm. "You think this is about protecting your family," I said, "but you've misunderstood. I came here prepared to protect myself, too." Ethan's head whipped toward me. "Rachel, what do you mean?" I let a small, steady smile cross my lips. "You'll see." And just like that, the power dynamic shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the game they thought they controlled was about to flip entirely. The prenup still sat on the table between us, its edges sharp against the white linen, like a blade waiting to cut. Charles leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, certain he'd cornered me. Victoria's smirk hadn't budged, her eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who believed the trap had already snapped shut. Ethan's hand brushed mine under the table, tentative, unsure. His voice was soft, almost pleading. "Rachel, maybe just sign it. It's not worth all this. Let's just get through the wedding." I turned my eyes to him. There was love in his gaze, but also fear. The kind of fear children carry when standing up to their parents feels impossible. My heart ached for him. He wasn't my enemy, but if I gave in now, if I let his parents define the terms of my marriage, I knew I would be handing them control of my life forever. So instead of reaching for their folder, I calmly reached down into my bag and pulled out a folder of my own. Sleek black leather, heavier than theirs. Its polished surface caught the chandelier light and seemed to glow as I placed it gently on the table. The Crawfords' smirks faltered for the first time. "What's this?" Charles asked, suspicion cutting through his bravado. I slid it toward him with steady hands. "My prenup." Ethan's head jerked toward me. "Rachel, what?" Victoria let out a sharp laugh. "Your prenup? Darling, what could you possibly have to protect?" I met her gaze without flinching. "Everything I've built, everything I've earned, everything you assumed I didn't have." Charles flipped the folder open, the pages rustling like a storm. His eyes scanned the first line, then the second, and the blood drained from his face. His confident posture sagged, replaced by disbelief. Victoria leaned in, snatching the papers from him. Her eyes darted over the figures, asset sheets, accounts, trust documents, and the legal signatures of one of the top firms in the country. Her voice came out as a whisper, trembling despite her attempt to steady it. This can't be real." "Oh, it's real," I said evenly. $15 million, built from nothing but hard work, persistence, and sleepless nights. I founded a company, scaled it, and sold it. That's what I've been protecting. Not because I had to, but because I refused to let anyone, including the two of you, treat me like a beggar at your table. Ethan looked at me in shock, his voice low and shaking. "Rachel, why didn't you tell me?" Finally, I turned to him, softening my tone. "Because I wanted to know if you loved me for me, Ethan, not for what I had, and you proved that you did, every day. That's why I kept it private. Not from you, but from people who would only see dollar signs instead of who I am." Victoria slammed the folder shut, her composure cracking. "This is manipulation," she spat. "You waltz in here, hide your fortune, and expect us to just—" "No," I interrupted, my voice firm but calm. "Manipulation is inviting me to dinner under the guise of family, then threatening to cancel the wedding unless I sign away my dignity. What I did was prepare. I prepared for people like you." Charles's fists clenched on the table. "You lied to us." I locked eyes with him. "I didn't owe you the truth. Respect has to be earned, Charles, and you never gave me that." For a long moment, the room was silent. The power they thought they held was slipping through their fingers, and they knew it. I leaned forward slightly, my tone quiet but cutting. "So here's how this goes. If we're talking about prenups, we use mine. It protects my assets, my independence, and ensures that no one," I let my eyes land on Victoria, "ever uses money as a weapon against me." Their faces froze. Shock, anger, humiliation. Ethan stared between us, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. He'd never seen me like this, so controlled, so resolute, so unwilling to bend. I pushed the leather folder closer to Charles, the sound of it sliding across the table echoing louder than his ultimatum had minutes before. "You wanted a prenup? Fine, but it will be mine. If you can't accept that, then this wedding doesn't happen, and I'll walk away knowing I didn't compromise who I am." The silence was deafening. For the first time, their smug arrogance was gone. In its place sat something far rarer: doubt. I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and waited. The battlefield had shifted. I was no longer the one on trial. They were. The air in the dining room grew heavy, thick with silence and unspoken rage. My folder lay open in front of Charles and Victoria, its pages sprawled across the table like evidence in a trial. They had expected me to be desperate, defenseless, ready to cling to Ethan at any cost. Instead, they were staring at a reality they couldn't control, and it was destroying them. Charles's face flushed red. He shoved the folder back toward me with such force the papers nearly scattered onto the floor. "You tricked us," he barked, his voice booming. "You've been hiding this fortune, playing some twisted game. Do you think deception is the foundation of marriage?" I kept my tone even. Deception? Number. But neither is blackmail. You invited me here, threatened me with the end of my marriage if I didn't sign away my rights. You wanted to humiliate me into submission. That isn't protection, that's control. Victoria slammed her hand on the table, her painted nails clicking against the wood. Her composure was cracking. "You came from nothing. You think a pile of money suddenly makes you one of us? You'll never be a Crawford, Rachel. You don't belong in this family." I leaned forward, my voice sharp but calm, cutting through her venom. "I never wanted to be a Crawford, Victoria. I wanted to be Ethan's wife. That's the only family that matters to me. And if you can't understand that, then maybe you've forgotten what marriage is even supposed to be about." Her eyes blazed with fury, but for once she had no clever retort. Ethan, silent until now, ran a hand through his hair, his voice finally breaking. "Rachel, why didn't you tell me about all of this?" I turned to him, softening, because he wasn't the enemy here, because I wanted to be sure. I wanted to know that you loved me for me, not for a number in an account. And you proved that you did, every day. But your parents? They never gave me a chance. They assumed the worst, they always did. Charles leaned forward, his voice shaking with rage. "You don't deserve my son. You'll destroy this family." Ethan snapped his head toward him, his voice louder than I had ever heard. "No, Dad. You're destroying this family." The room froze. Ethan pushed his chair back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His face was pale but resolute, his jaw set in defiance. "Do you hear yourselves? You've insulted Rachel since the day you met her. You've made her feel unwelcome, unworthy, like she had to prove herself to you just to exist in this house. And now, 2 days before our wedding, you try to force her to sign away her dignity? That's not love. That's manipulation." Victoria gasped, her voice trembling. "Ethan, how dare you speak to us this way?" "No, Mom!" He cut in sharply, his tone shaking with anger and pain. "For years I've tried to excuse it. I told myself you just needed time, that maybe you'd come around. But tonight, you showed me who you really are. You don't want me happy. You want me obedient." He reached for my hand under the table, gripping it tight. His eyes found mine, steady and unwavering. "Rachel is my future. If you can't accept her, then you don't get to be part of our wedding, or our life together." The silence that followed was crushing. Charles's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Victoria's face went pale, her perfectly painted lips trembling as though she'd just been slapped. For the first time since I'd known them, the Crawfords looked powerless. I stood slowly, my hand still clasped in Ethan's. My voice was calm, but it cut like glass. "I don't need your approval. I never did. But Ethan deserves parents who respect his choices, and I deserve in-laws who respect me as an equal. If you can't do that, then this is where we leave things." Neither of them spoke. Their silence was louder than any insult they could have hurled. Ethan and I turned toward the door, walking together through the cavernous hallway, our footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Behind us, the Crawfords sat frozen at their perfect dining table, their smug arrogance shattered into silence. And as we stepped out into the night air, I felt a weight lift off my chest. For the first time in months, I wasn't suffocating under their judgment. I hadn't begged. I hadn't yelled. I had stood my ground. And Ethan had chosen love over control. The battle was over, and we had won. The night we walked out of the Crawfords' mansion, the cool air hit my skin like a cleansing wave. For the first time in months, I felt light. Ethan's hand stayed clasped in mine, his grip firm and certain. Neither of us spoke on the drive home. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was relief. 2 days later, our wedding day arrived. It wasn't the grand society event the Crawfords had envisioned. It wasn't filled with politicians, investors, or the kind of people who measure worth in wealth. It was intimate, small, and achingly beautiful. We chose a garden venue surrounded by wildflowers with a string quartet playing softly under the summer sun. My mother, Linda, sat in the front row. Her eyes shimmered with tears, her proud smile never fading as she watched me walk down the aisle. For years, she had sacrificed so much to give me a chance at something better, and in that moment, I felt her pride wrap around me like armor. I had kept her words close. Never let anyone treat you like you're less than. And here I was, standing tall, marrying a man who loved me not because of money, not because of status, but because of who I was. The Crawfords weren't there. They had made their choice that night at the dinner table, and we had made ours. Part of me mourned that reality. Ethan deserved parents who supported him, who celebrated his happiness. But as we exchanged vows under a canopy of flowers, I realized something important. Sometimes family isn't defined by blood or marriage. Sometimes it's the people who stand beside you when you're most vulnerable, who fight for you, who lift you higher. After the ceremony, we celebrated with the people who truly mattered. Friends who had cheered us on from the beginning, my mother who had been my anchor, and Ethan who had finally found the courage to step out of his parents' shadow. It wasn't extravagant, but it was real. And that was worth more than any chandelier-lit ballroom. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and it was just the two of us, Ethan pulled me close, his eyes searching mine. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have stood up to them sooner. I should have protected you more." I cupped his face in my hands and shook my head gently. "You did protect me, Ethan, not by fighting them that night, but by choosing me, by standing with me when it mattered most. That's what love is." He kissed me then, slow and steady, and I knew with absolute certainty that we had built something stronger than the Crawfords' disapproval could ever tear down. In the weeks that followed, word spread among the family's social circles. The Crawfords had been humiliated by the revelation that the woman they had dismissed as a gold digger was actually wealthier and more independent than they could have imagined. Their arrogance had backfired, their power play leaving them looking small. But I didn't care about their reputation. What mattered to me was the life Ethan and I were building together, on equal terms with honesty and love as our foundation. And here's the truth I learned from all of it. Money can buy security, yes, but dignity is priceless. Respect is priceless. And no relationship, whether with a partner, in-laws, or anyone else, can survive without those two things. I didn't win by shouting. I didn't win by matching their cruelty with cruelty. I won by standing still, by being prepared, by refusing to shrink myself for their comfort. I didn't need to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. I only needed to protect my own. And that's the lesson I want you to take from this. If someone tries to make you feel small, if they hold their power over you and expect you to bow, remember this. True strength isn't in screaming or begging. It's in knowing your value so completely that you can walk away from anyone who refuses to see it. As for Ethan and me, our marriage isn't perfect. It never could be, but it's ours. Built on love, on respect, on the courage to face down those who tried to tear us apart. And every time I see him smile across the breakfast table or hear him humming while he cooks pasta, I'm reminded that I made the right choice. So now I'll leave you with a question. If you were in my shoes, sitting at that table staring down an ultimatum, what would you have done? Would you have signed their prenup to keep the peace? Or would you have stood your ground even if it meant walking away? Because in the end, your answer to that question isn't about money. It's about dignity. And that's how I learned one of the hardest lessons of my life. That love without respect isn't love at all. And that no amount of money or status can replace dignity. So now I want to hear from you. If you were sitting at that table 2 days before your wedding, would you have signed their prenup to keep the peace? Or stood your ground like I did? Tell me in the comments below. I'll be reading them. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to give it a like. It really helps the channel grow. Share it with someone who needs a reminder never to let anyone treat them like they're less than. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories just like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.